Did you know? At the 2009 Game Developers Conference, Nintendo hardware designer MASATO KUWAHARA showed off an unreleased successor to the Game Boy. This device was a precursor to the Game Boy Advance, and was codenamed Project Atlantis. The Atlantis name was chosen because the system was planned to release during the 1996 Olympics, which was taking place in Atlanta. This system had comparable specs to the Game Boy Advance, and would have been an incredibly powerful handheld for the time. British hardware designers ARM Holdings were contracted to create a power-saving ARM 710 CPU for Atlantis. This chip would have allegedly been so efficient that batteries could power Atlantis for up to 30 hours. However, the ARM CPU turned out to be inefficient for the device's needs, which caused performance issues. The device's internal components and form factor also led to its large size, which was ultimately the project's downfall. It was so huge that it couldn't fit inside the average pocket. While Nintendo were developing Atlantis, they allegedly made a game alongside the system titled Mario's Castle, though nothing on this game exists publicly, and it's unknown if the title was transformed into another game. Nintendo went back to square one on their Game Boy successor, but this left them with a problem. It would take several years to develop a replacement for Atlantis, and the Game Boy was already nearly a decade old. Both gamers and developers were expecting Nintendo to release new hardware that was closer to the performance of rival handhelds. Nintendo decided to develop an updated Game Boy with a faster processor and color display that would satisfy these needs until a true Game Boy successor came to market. In August 1999, word leaked that Nintendo was working on a new handheld system known as the Advanced Game Boy, and just 1 month after the rumors first spread, Nintendo formally announced the Game Boy Advance. After going back to the drawing board, development of the Game Boy Advance took about 2 years. It also took Nintendo just over a year to decide which CPU the system would use. A system's CPU needs to be powerful enough to process the amount of information being displayed on screen. Because of this, Nintendo explored several different screen sizes while deciding on the Advance's CPU. According to designer Masahiko Ota, the team even considered making the Advance's screen vertical instead of horizontal. They also looked into making the device itself vertical like previous Game Boys. Nintendo wanted the system to be comparable to the Super Nintendo in terms of power for easy porting of games, but with some additions. Their desire to essentially make a handheld SNES can be seen in the Advance's early dev kits, which had SNES controllers wired onto their circuit boards. Nintendo also stated that cell phone connectivity would be a major focus for the new system. They claimed that by connecting a cell phone to the Game Boy Advance, players would be able to download and play multiplayer games, enter chat rooms, and read email, all on the Advance itself. In August 2000, Nintendo released more information about the Game Boy Advance, including its design, battery life, and price. Nintendo of America board member Peter Main announced the system would have some kind of modem, but no other information was given. By that time, developers had advanced development kits in their hands, and there wasn't a shred of any internet or network support for the system. The final look of the Game Boy Advance was made by French designer Gwenel Nicolas and his studio Curiosity Inc. This wasn't the only shape Nintendo experimented with, however. Even before the original Advance was finalized, Nintendo tested a clamshell design similar to the Game Boy Advance SP. The hardware team temporarily abandoned the clamshell, believing it to be too thick. One thing the team refused to abandon was backwards compatibility. Nintendo literally checked every single Game Boy and Game Boy Color game on the Advance to make sure it was fully backwards compatible. Hardware designer Ryuji Umezu said, "We're checking all of the previous Game Boy games for compatibility. There are a lot of titles, so that is pretty difficult. We have Nintendo employees along with part-time staff checking all of them." The Game Boy Advance was programmed to switch over to Game Boy Color mode when it detected the contents of a Game Boy or Color cartridge. However, Nintendo Research and Engineering General Manager Satoru Okada couldn't get this code to work. Okada then asked engineers to make a physical switch in the system's cartridge slot to change modes instead. The Game Boy Micro lacked this physical switch, and therefore lost the ability to play Game Boy or Game Boy Color games. The Game Boy Advance had instant and continued success, so much so that Nintendo released a redesigned system called the SP, which was an abbreviation for Special. Former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata wanted to include a sleep mode on the SP, but it couldn't be implemented within their timeframe. Having learned from his mistake, Iwata demanded a sleep mode be included in the Nintendo DS from the start. Nintendo also experimented with a touchscreen panel adapter for the SP, which would also be included as standard in the Nintendo DS. Nintendo even tried using 3D LCD tech with the SP, but they weren't happy with the results. The resolution was too small to produce a pleasing 3D image, and the processing power of the Advance struggled to render stereoscopic images. After the SP, Nintendo launched the Game Boy Micro, but this wasn't the last piece of Game Boy Advance hardware to be released. The Visteon dockable entertainment featuring Game Boy Advance was released in 2006 and was a DVD player that could play Advance games. The device was portable and meant for traveling in a car or other vehicle. Because of its specialized nature, the Visteon system couldn't be purchased at general retailers and was instead sold at car dealerships. Visteon was apparently interested in creating similar products using hardware from the DS and Wii, but neither of these projects came to fruition. Speaking of unusual Game Boy Advance hardware, there's an Advance add-on that was specifically made to help young people with diabetes. The Gluco Boy has 2 full video games and mini arcade stored on it. Whenever the user tests their blood levels with the Gluco Boy, they earn points that can be used to unlock games or purchase in-game items and features. The add-on was made after its creator, Paul Wessel, noticed his son wasn't testing his blood levels as often as he should be. Wessel decided that since his son loved playing his Game Boy Advance, he'd make something that incentivized the boy to check his blood levels more often. Similar to how the Super Game Boy allowed Game Boy games to be played on a TV through their SNES, the Wide Boy 64 allowed gamers to play advanced games on their TV through a Nintendo 64. These adapters were made for private use and allowed developers and publications to view games on a bigger screen. The Wide Boy 64 was developed by Intelligent Systems, who also created the Fire Emblem and Paper Mario series. However, the term Wide Boy is a generic name for adapters that allow Game Boy family games to be played through a console, and have been made for several Nintendo consoles. In fact, 2 other Wide Boy adapters were made for the Nintendo 64 specifically to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Much like the Super Game Boy, the Wide Boy 64 has almost all of the components of a Game Boy Advance inside it, besides the screen and buttons. Game Boy Advance games also came to other consoles via emulation through the Virtual Console. What's interesting about this is that the Game Boy Advance emulation on the Wii U wasn't even programmed by Nintendo. It was instead developed by the company M2, who are best known for their work on the eShop's 3D Classics series, as well as the Sega Ages series. This isn't the only Advance-related tech that wasn't developed by Nintendo. The technology in the system's Game Boy Advance video cartridges was actually developed by 4Kids Technology. These video cartridges were manufactured by Majesco Entertainment, with the exception of the Pokemon video cartridges, which were made by Nintendo. Using its established franchises, Nintendo made several tech demos to illustrate the Game Boy Advance's visuals, including a Zelda 2 and Yoshi's Story demo. However, other companies have used Nintendo characters as placeholders in their own tech demos. One of these demos is Mario Kart XXL by Daenerys Entertainment Software. The demo has Mario driving around a course with some interesting visuals. The purpose of the demo was to show how multiple background layers can be used to create the illusion of vertical depth. The result is something like having 2 of the SNES's Mode 7 layers rendering at the same time. And if you're interested in more Mario Kart facts, check out the DidYouKnowGaming extra video on screen. It talks about how Mario Kart 8 was censored and shares some facts about other kart racing games.